Good morning, or whatever time of day it happens to be where you are. My name is Argo Vermeer. This is my YouTube channel. This YouTube channel is an offshoot of my blog, or associated with my blog, unreformingtheology.com, where I deal with everything from science to religion to politics to current events, through in examining these things and these schools of thought through a metaphysical lens. So I look at what are the underlying assumptions about the nature of man and reality that are implicit or intrinsic to whatever issue is at hand. So that's kind of my focus. So it's unreformingtheology.com is the blog, where it's actually not all that much about theology, ironically. So now today I thought, and for those of you that are here, thank you for being here. To the handful of people that listen, I really do appreciate it. I know it's a very low-tech channel. I don't offer a lot in the way of anything other than words. So, no graphics, no music. It's definitely a very low-tech operation. So I do appreciate anybody who's here and engaging with the channel. So today I was thinking, why do people persist in their madness? Now, I'm not talking about why insane people are insane. Like, why are clinically insane people, why do they persist in their insanity? Well, because they have a problem with their brain. They are neurodivergent, I think is the new politically correct term. So I understand that people that don't have a grip on reality, I understand if they have why certain people with clinical psychological problems persist in their madness. I understand that. I mean, why do seemingly sane, normal, healthy people persist in their madness? So they have an idea that is irrational, but they are hell-bent on pursuing it to the very end, regardless of the chaos and destruction that this idea and the attempt to implement it are creating. So that's the question. Why do sane people, normal, healthy, neural non-divergent people, why do they persist in ideas that observably create chaos, destruction, chaos, destruction, that don't work, that simply don't work? They create societies and they create contexts which are chaotic and destructive and irrational and pointless, and might even lead to death and pain and misery and et cetera, et cetera. Why does that happen? And so you could look at California. You look at California. You look at the political policies in California. Ideas like, well, we're not going to prosecute anybody who steals anything of a value less than $1,000. If whatever you're stealing is less than $1,000, we're simply not going to prosecute. That's clearly insane. That's madness. And this has resulted in a lot of businesses going out of business, a lot of businesses pulling out of California, rampant uptick in crime, a rise in unemployment because if you can steal $1,000 per day or per week or whatever it is, why work? You could, I hazard, you could get everything you need for under $1,000. Probably, if there's some way you could steal less than $1,000 once every couple of weeks, you probably could obtain everything that you need to basically survive. I think $1,000 every week or every couple of weeks or so is enough to survive. So why work? So it's chaotic political policies like that. Open border. America. I hesitate to even call it America anymore because we have no border. It's not even really a country. A country without a border isn't a country. I mean, you don't have any geopolitical state. There's no geopolitical identity or nation state without a border. by definition. If there's no border, then there's no state, there's no nation. So the USA, whenever I think of the initials USA or I see United States of America in my mind, there's always quotation marks around it or an asterisk, because we're not really a country anymore. We don't have really any border. And yet the ruling class, the government, will not do anything to close the border. It's just not something they're interested in. And clearly this undermines their very authority. When you don't have a border, the very idea that you have a ruling class or a government, that idea becomes incongruent. It becomes ironic. It becomes a false, irrational idea. You're not in charge of a country because there's no country. There's no government of America. There's no America. Now, I understand the fundamentals that the border is entirely under the control of the state. If the state wanted to close it, if the government in America wanted to close the border, it would be closed in 5 minutes. We all understand that the only reason that the border is open is because the ruling class, it's politically convenient for the ruling class to have the border open. As soon as it's no longer politically convenient for the border to be open, they will close the border. This is not a big secret. So no, the border is under full control of the state. They don't want it closed because it is in the power interest of the ruling class to keep it open. And once it isn't, they'll close it. We know this. But still, even the idea that it would be in the interest of the political elite to have basically a borderless nation, even that's nonsensical once you start to examine it beyond the superficial. So that's just the idea that the state would use the border as a tool of political convenience in and of itself is madness, and it's going to result in nothing but chaos and collapse and misery and all that kind of stuff. So the question is, why do people continue to persist in this? Why do sane people continue to persist in their madness? Why did Japan not surrender? Japan was clearly going to lose the war. They had the Soviets on one side, they had the Americans on the other side, and now to be fair, I think half of the military was in favor of surrendering at that point. I mean, America had dropped 2 nuclear bombs, but even more than that, you had Soviet Russia was starting to invade the Japanese resources in China. And I think that more than anything pushed them towards surrender. But the point being is that half of the military wanted to go down fighting. It didn't matter that everything was over. The war was lost long ago. You had, I think, fully half or a significant portion of people in the military leadership wanted to continue fighting to the very end, to the death. Same thing with National Socialist Germany. Why do sane people persist in their madness, even when ostensibly everything's over, there's no winning, it's all just chaos, but nevertheless, they're going to continue to act as though their ideas are somehow rational and somehow can still manifest something meaningful. Why do we do this? And I had a friend, I say had, I guess I'm still friends with him, I just haven't talked to him in like 10 years. But there was a friend of mine who said something one time that I thought, and I'm probably going to botch the quote, but it's one of my favorite quotes ever. And I wish I could remember, I should have memorized it. But it was, and it's a guy named John Immel said that if you see masses of people engaging in the same irrational and self-destructive actions, find the assumption and you will find the cause. So, in other words, find out the metaphysics. What do they believe about the nature of reality and themselves? What do they believe about the nature of man and reality? And you will see and you will understand why they continue to act the way they do. When you see masses of people acting in the exact same self-destructive and irrational ways, find the assumptions and you will find the cause. If you want to know why California continues to behave the way California does, ask yourself, what are the metaphysics? What do the people in charge of running California believe about the nature of reality and man? Same thing with the Japanese. Why did the Japanese, so many of them, want to keep on fighting to the death? in the midst of absolute chaos, in the midst of having to resort to kamikaze attacks, which for all the professed the professed honor and glory of such an act is really just the last desperate flailings of a dying ideology. I mean, that's all it is. I mean, the idea that you're sacrificing yourself to some abstract, ethereal ideology is proof that you've lost. If you, as a human being, can never prosper from this idea because you are going to be entirely sacrificed to it, you're going to be murdered in service to it, to a point where you can't experience it, then it's irrelevant to you, and you are a rank idea. It doesn't. It is madness. It is reasonlessness over reason at that point. You've lost. So you go, well, what do they believe about the nature of man and reality? What is it that they believe about themselves and about their reality that makes them persist in this clearly self-destructive, chaotic, and a torturous, violent, meaningless ideology? Why do they keep doing it? It doesn't work. Why do they keep doing it? Why does the carpenter continue to try to make a square circle, a table that's in the shape of a square and a circle? Why do governments continue to persist in their political agenda, even when it clearly doesn't work, even when it drives the nation into massive amounts of unpayable debt? It creates social and ethical disintegration, moral disintegration, crime, chaos, misery, victims, destruction, murder. Why? Not everybody's insane. It's not that they're clinically insane. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're normal, healthy people, but they're continuing to act in service to this idea. Why? Well, you might think it's complicated. We hear that, oh, it's complicated. It's all so complicated. Like, why the Japanese wanted to keep fighting to the bitter end. Why the National Socialists in Germany why California continue, and even America writ large continues to persist in this political agenda that clearly doesn't work. Why they can't see the irony of their every action. Why? It's so complicated, you see. There's just so many factors. It's a complicated issue. It's who can understand. That's why we need the psychologists and the social scientists and blah blah blah. It's actually not that hard. Once you understand the metaphysics, you understand why. And the why is this. The why is collectivism versus individualism. Collectivist metaphysics versus individualist metaphysics. Now, I have talked about this in the previous couple of uploads. You can always boil down this kind of behavior, this sane people acting in service to insane ideas, in spite of the obvious negative and self-destructive and destructive results. You can always boil it down to this. That kind of behavior is a function of collectivist metaphysics. This kind of behavior is done by people who presume a collectivist interpretation of themselves in reality, as opposed to an individualist. Sounds too simple, right? Metaphysics can't be simply bifurcated. It's not simply either or, is it? It can't be that black and white. It's got to be much more complicated than that. Well, it can be complicated when you look at the iterations of collectivism, like, for example, the differences between the collectivism of the Soviet Union and the collectivism of fascist Japan or fascist Germany. Certainly it's more complicated in the fact that this collectivist iteration is different and it manifests itself differently in what I would say are superficial ways. But certainly when you want to get into the different kind of political ideologies and political machinations of different collectivist governments, the fascists versus the socialists versus you could even say the representative Democrats, the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, they're all collectivist. So, you can certainly make this issue more complicated by focusing on what are non-metaphysical or relatively superficial distinctions. And I say superficial because metaphysically they're meaningless, but I mean, certainly they're not superficial in the way that people experience them. Like the experience of a citizen living in the United States of America is going to be different than the experience living under somebody in Nazi Germany or imperialist Japan, obviously. So it's, the experience is quite profoundly different, but the metaphysics are the same, and the result ultimately is the same, the conclusion. But the reasons why are very simple. It's really just the difference between collectivism and individualism. The reason is always collectivist. People who are sane, that act in service to ideas that don't work and result in only chaos, collapse, torment, and self-destruction, are functioning according to collectivist metaphysics. Now, collectivist metaphysics, as I've said before, not to get into too much of the details, to keep this more simple and straightforward, the individual doesn't exist per se. You, yourself, don't exist. So your conscious frame of reference is insufficient at best. Fundamentally, it's not real. Everything that you experience and observe from your singular conscious frame of reference, the frame of reference of your capital S self, is fundamentally a lie. Because your self, your singular conscious identity, isn't real. It's an epiphenomenon. It's a function of some process outside of you. There's some force or power outside of you that has created this. So your conscious frame of reference is really an expression of an outside source, which means it's not actually a frame of reference, you see. There's no actual observation going on if the observer isn't actually himself the observer. So your consciousness is really a direct function of some kind of some kind of biological evolution, or some kind of laws of nature or physics, or some kind of mathematical organization of the universe. So it has created this consciousness that you have, right? Or your consciousness is a direct function of God. God created you and your consciousness. So you are never fully yourself. Yourself is an illusion. Yourself, meaning your conscious, singular, individual frame of reference, is really a function of something outside of it, which means it's not actually a frame of reference, you see? It's a lie. At best, it gives you only a shadow of reality. You can peek into reality, but you never have access to capital T truth. Your conscious individual frame of reference is insufficient to the apprehension of real truth. It is insufficient to truth, and therefore it cannot act in service to it. So your consciousness can't really know anything fundamentally, and therefore it can't do anything. Your will and your agency can't act in service to any truth. It can't actually make a valid or an objectively valid choice or move you in an objectively valid direction, because it's never functioning according to any real knowledge. So you as an individual are both epistemologically and ethically incompetent. You are insufficient because yourself is a lie. There is no individual. There is no individual frame of reference. Your conscious frame of reference isn't a frame of reference. You as an observer don't exist because you are a function, a direct and absolute function of something outside of you. You aren't you. You are an expression of biological evolution or the laws of nature or God's will, God's creative power. You are a direct function of something outside of you. Therefore, you, qua you, don't exist, which means whatever you think you're seeing, whatever you think you're experiencing, no matter how chaotic or traumatic or pointless or miserable or destructive, isn't really whatever you think you're perceiving is not the truth. Though you might perceive your ideology, when it is implemented, as being destructive or chaotic or pointless or traumatizing or meaningless, that might be how you perceive it, but your perception is flawed. You see, because you don't really exist as such, you are obligated to that which owns you. You are obligated to that from which your entire self is, meaning you don't exist as such. So the individual, in collectivist metaphysics, the fundamental metaphysical point is the individual is a lie. Every individual, you, me, every human being, is really a function of something outside of them, some abstract, what I call the collective ideal. capital C, capital I, the collective ideal. The individual is merely a manifestation of some collective identity. Now, in Soviet Russia, the true and real collective identity, the real collective, was the working class, right? So the working class, the Communist Party, the proletariat, this was the collective ideal. The proletariat, the working class, this is that from which the individuals are properly expressions. Your job, therefore, as an individual is to forsake your individuality and devote yourself entirely into obedience to your collective ideal, the working class. You exist to merely express the will and wish of the working class. That's your collective ideal. Your collective ideal can be God. In fascist Germany, the collective ideal was the Aryan race. In fascist Japan, the collective ideal was the Japanese race, the imperialist Japanese race. There's a collective ideal to which the sum and substance of your consciousness and your agency is obligated, because that's your natural root. So, meaning that you are never in a position to make any kind of ethical judgment on anything. Your sole responsibility is obedience. There's a collective ideal, and that collective ideal has established a ruling class, an authority. So an incarnate authority of itself on earth. And they will dictate truth to you, and they will dictate your requisite behavior to you. You are never in a position to make any judgments. What you think is chaos, you are not in a position to know. You are only in a position to obey. The same thing holds true for members of the authority. You'd say, well, aren't the authorities, the members of the ruling class, aren't they somehow able to, don't they get some kind of absolution on their innate human insufficiency to knowledge and truth? Wouldn't they have to have some kind of absolution in order for them to rule? Well, yes and no. But in general, even though once you rise to a position of authority in the ruling class that acts in service to some kind of a collective ideal, whether that collective ideal is your church, your tribe, your race, your economic class, even your nation, or even something as nebulous and vague as the people, the capital P, America, we the people are the collective idea. What does it mean to be the people? It takes a little bit of digging to figure out what does America mean by the people? What is America's collective idea? America isn't founded on any idea of individuality. That's a lie, because no government, there's no such thing as a legal authority being established in service to the individual. The individualist metaphysics do not recognize authority as a legitimate metaphysical expression, because the individual is sufficient in and of himself to the apprehension of truth and acting in service to it, according to individualist metaphysics. Therefore, they don't need an authority to dictate truth to them and to dictate their behavior by law. So America has a collective identity too. It's called the people. Well, what does the people mean? Well, that's a topic for another day. But even America has a collective identity. The point being, the collective identity can be anything as specific as the Aryan race or the Japanese race. And it can be something as nebulous and sort of as hyper abstract as the people. But the point being is that once you've risen to a position of authority in the ruling class, you are pretty much on the hook for acting in service to the collective ideal. So even the people that are in charge, they're wholly devoted to their collective ideal, which means that when they're passing laws that result in object and patent and errant chaos and destruction, it doesn't matter. Their first and foremost identity is the collective ideal. It doesn't matter what they may be seeing it not working, but who they are means nothing. They're obligated to continue to pursue the interest of the collective ideal, because that's all they exist to do. You exist to be an expression of the collective ideal. No matter what you think, no matter what you see, no matter what you feel, it's irrelevant. Your job is simply to act in service to your collective ideal. That is the capital T truth. It is always the truth. All of reality must comport to it. The individual is never sufficient to pass judgment. The individual is never in a position to make demands, to ask questions. He is only in a position to obey. So ideologues or people that buy into fundamentalist collectivist thinking are going to act in service to collectivist ideals and collectivist metaphysics, regardless of what they feel and see and think as individuals. And that's why, no matter the amount of chaos, destruction, and misery wrought, people who are ostensibly sane will persist in the implementation of their bad ideas and their faulty ideas, even until the very end, even until collapse. Now, I don't have any notes for this. I understand that perhaps this was a little muddy and hard to follow. I hope that you gleaned something from this. But yeah, if you want to know why people act, ostensibly sane people continue to act in ways that clearly create chaos and misery, it's because they're acting according to some collectivist premise, some collectivist metaphysical premise. They understand that they, as individuals, are not in a position to ever ask questions. They're not in a position to doubt, even unto their own death. They exist solely to be an expression of the collective ideal, of that metaphysical group identity, the people, the race, the tribe, the working class, the church, God's will. They act according, fundamentally, their epistemology is fundamentally blind faith. They can't know. They are insufficient in and of themselves to know. Their observational conscious frame of reference is insufficient to truth. Therefore, there's only one thing left for them to do: obey. And they will obey until until it's all over. They're dead and everything they touch has been destroyed. It's because they're acting in service to a collectivist assumption. That's why. It's why in the church you find people, and the thing that is so startling to me, it's not startling now that I know, but it used to be so startling to me, is that in church you would be around people that, if anybody of any amount of erudition or articulation were to question their beliefs, could get these people to punt their entire faith into the cosmic abyss of God's mystery in 5 minutes. You could randomly pick out any Christian worshiping in any church in this country, I noticed, and you could quiz them on the foundations and fundamentals of their faith. And if you knew what you were doing and you knew how to ask, you could get them easily, within 5 minutes or less, to punt their entire faith, their entire philosophical premise by which they lived their entire life. They organized and directed their entire life by this faith. You could get them to punt it into the cosmic abyss of cognitive dissonance in 5 minutes or less. They would shrug their shoulders and go, I don't know, it's a mystery. Who can understand God's ways? God's ways are above man's ways. My job is simply to believe God and obey. They would direct the entire sum and substance of their life, their family's life, their children's lives, into an ideology that you could get them to basically repudiate, not openly, not explicitly, but you could basically get them to repudiate within 5 minutes or less. They'd shrug their shoulders and go, I don't really know. It's a mystery. It's God's mystery. That is nuts, people. That is nuts. And look, I'm a Christian. But I'm not going to, I tell you what. In order to remain a Christian, had to understand my faith at its metaphysical level. And those metaphysics had to make sense. I could not accept being a Christian that could punt the entire underlying psychological, spiritual, and philosophical superstructure into some kind of black hole of cognitive dissonance in 5 minutes. So I had to take some time to go, what is this doctrine that we believe in? Is this really the doctrine that we find in the Bible? And does this really rationally describe God? And if the answer is no, what does? And if nothing does, then God isn't real. But the metaphysics of my faith are actually rational and legitimate. If you can step outside of orthodox doctrine, quote unquote, long enough to actually examine what it is you believe, you can actually find the truth there. And I did, thankfully. But I had to leave. I had to leave. I had to leave the organized church because it was appalling to me that that people would punt their entire superstructure so quickly and easily. And I'm not saying this was a handful of people. I'm saying the vast majority of Christians have no idea fundamentally what they believe. None at all. They don't know what God is. They don't know they don't even understand. If you were to say, describe your God as the metaphysical primary, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They wouldn't know what a metaphysical primary is. That's a problem because that's what God represents, even according to their irrational orthodox doctrine. He's a metaphysical primary, but they've never even heard that term. They would never describe God in those philosophical terms, and that's a problem because that's the root of truth. Getting the metaphysics right is the root of truth, and if you can't get those right, or you don't even know what they are, you're never going to have a faith or an idea or a philosophy worth anything. You're not. So, but again, I'm not trying to say this is a particular problem of the left or of the right. No, this is a problem. The failure to understand the fundamental difference between collectivist metaphysics and individualist metaphysics is a problem that runs the gamut of all kinds of contexts in the world, from religious to educational to government. The world fundamentally rests on collectivist metaphysical presumptions, and that's why it doesn't work so much of, if not the vast majority of the time. It's why governments collapse. It's why churches split. It's why there are religious wars. It's why you have nations with no border that still call themselves nations. It's why you have tyranny and totalitarianism and chaos and murder and theft and death and destruction. It's why you have all of these things. Human existence, the human experience, is defined in terms, the vast majority of the time, by collectivist metaphysical assumptions. And that's why it so often doesn't work. That's why simply being alive is an exercise in frustration, in exasperation. And that's why you go, why can't we just have nice things? You know, I'm trying to think. Anyway, well, I don't want to get too bogged down, but that's why things always. That's why waking up in the West today and in America today, for so many of us, is an exercise in frustration and exasperation. You look around, you're going, this doesn't make sense to me. Why? Why are we doing this? This is clearly insane. Well, the answer is easy. Collectivist metaphysics. People at some very fundamental and root in subconscious level that has been instilled in them since they were very, very small, function according to the idea that they can't really know anything. Their individual conscious frame of reference is in some sense an illusion, that their job is to outsource their very individuality and their very sense of self to some legal authority outside of them, to some collective ideal, because they aren't real. Their consciousness is an illusion. I saw an article pop up on my Google news feed the other day. I didn't read the article because I already knew it was a bunch of Platonist nonsense. But it was like, consciousness evolved, not for the self, not to benefit the self, but to benefit the community. This is the kind of bullshit we get from the scientific community. Again, consciousness evolved. Consciousness, your conscious frame of reference, isn't real. There's no observer. There's no you. There can't be an observer if there's no real observational frame of reference, because the frame of reference is a function of something outside of it. Your conscious frame of reference is a function of evolution, biological and physical evolution. That's what your consciousness is a product of. And it didn't, therefore, develop to promote you as an individual, but to promote your community, your collective identity. Even in science. Well, the reason why science has always been pushing collectivist metaphysics is because science in and of itself. Science is completely insufficient to apprehend and explain consciousness because the observer is a prerequisite for doing science. Science is a methodology. If there's no observer, if there's no one doing the science, then there's no science. The consciousness cannot be, the observer cannot be a direct function of something outside of him. The conscious observer, i.e. the scientist, if he is a direct function of something outside of him, he doesn't actually exist, and therefore there's no one to do the science. Science can't explain what consciousness is. Consciousness is a metaphysical proposition. It is philosophically discerned, not scientifically discerned, without the prerequisite, the a priori existence of the conscious observer. There's no science. Science only comes after we've established the metaphysical truth of the consciousness and conscious observer. But science wants to see itself as the end-all and be-all of truth. It jettisons the metaphysical, and therefore it jettisons the conscious observer, and therefore it explains the conscious observer in the same way that so many organized religions explain God. They shrug it off. It becomes a cognitive dissonance. The consciousness isn't really real. Actually, that wasn't a good analogy. It wasn't the way that it was. It's the same way that religions explain themselves as products of God, the same way atheists and scientific determinists explain themselves as functions of the laws of nature and the laws of evolution. Fundamentally, you understand the collectivist metaphysics between scientific atheists and religious people are the same. You see what I'm saying? Both of them outsource their consciousness to some all-powerful determinist force outside of them. So in the same way, the Orthodox religion will say, well, I just obey God. There's no real me here. My consciousness is an illusion. I'm a function of God's will. Therefore, I'm really insufficient in and of myself to apprehend truth and act in service to it because I'm not really here. I don't really have a real frame of reference. I'm just here as an expression of God. Well, you see the same thing in science. Individuals are just expressions of evolution, of scientific determinism. Science is the New World religion. Science is the observed. Science is the inevitable conclusion of Christian metaphysics. Atheism, the irony here is that atheism is really the predictable and ineluctable conclusion, postmodern conclusion of Christian metaphysics. That's the irony. Christian metaphysics, as they stand, as a function of, well, I link Christian metaphysics as we would know them are a function of the synthesis of Christianity with the state. So you had Christianity became synthesized with the Roman state, and then you had the formalization of the doctrine kind of take root with St. Augustine, and then this gives rise to what we know as the Christian metaphysics that we're all familiar with for the last couple thousand years or so. And so, ironically, atheism is simply really the postmodern product of these Christian metaphysics. There's no you, there's no consciousness. Consciousness is an illusion. We're all just a function of some all-powerful force outside of us. Science is just postmodern Christianity, in other words. It's really weird like that. It's really interesting like that. But the same way atheistic scientists and the same way atheists, almost all atheists I would submit are scientific determinists. So the same way atheists relate to consciousness, individualness, individuality, and individual consciousness is the same way that Orthodox religions do. It's not really real. And so if you want to know where all the insanity comes from and why human beings continue to persist in these irrational ideas that result in misery and chaos and collapse, even though ostensibly we're still sane, look at the collectivist metaphysics. What are the assumptions about the nature of man? You're not real. You are obligated to act in service to some authority that acts on behalf of some collective ideal. Your job is simply to obey, not to judge, not to ask questions, not to feel, not to think, to recognize your fundamental existential insufficiency and simply obey your authoritarian masters. And those authoritarian masters are acting in service to some ineluctable, infinite, and infinitely abstract collective ideal, which means they will implement this ideal until every last one of us is dead, if they have to. Because who are we? Who are we to judge? So, anyway, I hope this was informative to you. I know it's a bit rambling and a bit long. I hope that you find some of this helpful. If you do, please do all that YouTube stuff, like, share, subscribe, and all that. That would be great. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Check out my blog if you want to. Thank you to the handful of people that are listening and give me your time. I really appreciate it. And for those of you that are feeling exasperated and vexed and frustrated, I feel you. I'm here just trying to answer your questions. I'm trying to give you a little light of understanding. So, I mean, it doesn't make it less annoying, but at least you don't have to be confused about it anymore. I mean, at least you don't have to wonder why. Now you know why. It doesn't have to exasperate you or frustrate you. It can be painful and annoying, but if all I've done is to alleviate a little bit of your frustration and take away some of your bewilderment, then I've done my job. And I hope I've done that. So anyway, thanks for being here. Have a great day, week, whatever. And hopefully you'll tune in next time. And until then, this is Argo Vermeer. This is my YouTube channel. And I will talk at you later. Take care. Bye.